The UN condemns the US for its recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. But instead of diplomacy, America says, fall in line or you'll lose your aid. I'm Kamali Melbourne, and today's newsmaker is the US threat to the United Nations. This week started with the United States using its veto to block a UN Security Council resolution. Ambassador Nikki Haley said its decision to move the US Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem was a matter of US sovereignty. But the US could not use its veto at an emergency session of the General Assembly, so the White House resorted to threats. President Trump told his cabinet and the world, let them vote against us, we'll save a lot, presumably from the billions of dollars in aid given to nations in Africa, South America and Asia. Now, in a break with diplomacy, Haley said she's taking the names of those who go against the US. So what impact will these tactics have on the future of Jerusalem? We'll debate that in a moment, but first, Vanessa Keneally has this.
The result of the voting is as follows: 14 votes in favour, 1 vote against.
It was the first veto cast by the United States in the UN Security Council in almost 7 years. Donald Trump wants Jerusalem recognised as Israel's capital and says he'll move the American embassy there. But on the Security Council, only the US agrees.
The United States will not be told by any country where we can put our embassy. Buried even deeper in the jargon of this resolution is the accusation that the United States is setting back the prospects of peace in the Middle East. That is a scandalous charge. What we witnessed here today in the Security Council is an insult. It won't be forgotten.
Hours later, the US made another threat.
For all of these nations that take our money and then they vote against us at the Security Council, or they vote against us potentially at the Assembly. They take hundreds of millions of dollars and even billions of dollars, and then they vote against us.
And he's not exaggerating. According to the US government agency, US aid helps a lot of countries around the world, handing out $49 billion in economic funding last year alone. But the threat of this money being taken away doesn't seem to have changed many minds.
We always unansweringly support and promote the Middle East peace process, back the Palestinians and their righteous cause of resuming their legitimate national interests. This position will never change.
The world has changed. The notion of I am powerful, therefore I am right has changed. Now the world is rising against the unfair. From now on, no honorable nation, no honorable state will bow to such pressure.
This is really new definition of world order in politics, and it seems that the American administration, they are putting their stamp on a new political reality.
As politicians argue, Palestinians clash with Israeli forces in the occupied West Bank, a daily occurrence since Trump first recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital on December the 6th. Many people are now wondering whether the UN is capable of convincing the US president to change his mind for the sake of peace. Although for now, that seems highly unlikely.
Well, we're watching those votes. Let them vote against us. We'll save a lot. We don't care.
Vanessa Keneally, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Ambassador Thomas Pickering. He's a former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations and Israel. Also in Washington is Wael Al-Zayed, who's advised the U.S. delegation at the UN under President Obama. He's now the CEO of Mgage USA. And from London, we have Jeffrey Alderman. He's a professor of Jewish history and politics at the University of Buckingham. Gentlemen, welcome. Ambassador Pickering, first to you. As a man who's seen the inner workings of the United Nations firsthand, what impact will today's vote at the General Assembly have?
Kamali, thank you. Not good, certainly. The use of pressure of this kind to induce a vote has its own consequences in terms of how and in what way people will look at that in terms of their total relationship with the United States, and a country which is unfortunately losing popularity internationally as we watch is not going to increase that and as a result, its overall influence by these kinds of threats. There are even stories here in Washington that the Democrats will try to block any effort to do this in the Congress. I'm not sure that will work, but in the past, Secretary Baker, at the time of the passage of the use of force resolution back in 1990, told Yemen they would lose their assistance if Yemen indeed voted against that resolution. Yemen did. They lost their assistance over time. That was repaired. This is a general threat and obviously can have general negative consequences.
Jeffrey Alderman, in London, are you concerned that there seems to be an even further growing antithesis to the recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital after Donald Trump's announcement just a couple of weeks ago?
No, I'm not concerned. In fact, last April, President Putin of Russia announced that Russia was recognizing East Jerusalem as the capital of a Palestinian state and West Jerusalem as the capital of the Jewish state. No one made a great fuss over that. So am I concerned? No, I'm not really concerned. I understand that the Czech Republic has announced that it now recognizes West Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. This is simply recognizing facts on the ground, isn't it?
Perhaps. Well, Anzayata in Washington for us. So we've heard from Ambassador Pickering saying that this is going to have a negative impact. There's no concern from the backers of this decision. So what use is the United Nations in this particular instance in having this vote?
I think right now the use really is mainly symbolic, demonstrating the international community's concern regarding the, quite frankly, the walking away of the United States of its position in terms of supporting a political settlement to the question of Jerusalem. But beyond that, really, you know, as somebody who has covered the Middle East for 10 years, I'm afraid that neither this posturing on the part of the OIC and the UN in general is going to lead to an actual improvement on the situation on the ground, nor will these threats by the administration, quite frankly, to blackmail countries, perhaps poor countries, will really either help the Palestinians and the Israelis achieve the peace they desire, nor certainly help our bilateral relationships with important countries in important parts of the world.
I mean, symbolism is one thing, isn't it, Wael? Because where the United Nations was set up to be a sort of a beacon of hope for the world after the Second World War, it also was meant to do things. And yet it keeps being outmaneuvered at every turn recently.
You know, it is something that's had begun long before this confrontation here. Again, you know, I worked on Syria, for example, for a number of years, and I saw painfully how the Russians and the Chinese, but particularly the Russians, undermined the very reason the Security Council is in existence. And we all know the United States, in its steadfast support for Israel, has also wielded its influence and obviously the veto on numerous occasions to at times halt any meaningful progress. So it definitely undermines the institution of the Security Council and the General Assembly writ large when the body is just seen as a place where the elite get together, complain about one another's country, and then go home.
Jeffrey Alderman, there are many resolutions levelled against Israel. They're probably weekly at certain times, and they come to a head every now and again. Is the Israeli leadership at all concerned about the position they find themselves in now in 2017, or do they think they can just work around the auspices of the United Nations?
Oh, I don't think they're concerned at all. There has never been what is known as a Chapter 7 resolution against Israel in the United Nations. Now, a Chapter 7 resolution would be mandatory, and that would be a serious state of affairs.
But isn't that because of the vetoes being used by the United States?
Exactly, that's what I was about to say, exactly. So they have got the sort of American president that they want. He is playing to a domestic Christian evangelical audience as much as to an international audience. And are the Israelis concerned about the UN? Absolutely not. And so far as the so-called peace process is concerned, insofar as there is a peace process of any sort, Where are the Palestinians going to go? Are they going to go to Russia? I don't think so. Are they going to go to China? Well, the economic relationship between China and Israel is closer than it's ever been. This past week, we learned that the first Israeli university to set up a campus in Israel, that plan is going ahead. So that the Palestinians have run out of options.
Ambassador Pickering, can you pick up on some of that? Do you think it is now probably time for the Palestinians perhaps to try and work outside of the United Nations? I mean, there's been a peace of some sorts or some kind of resolution perhaps being brought to the war in Syria by the Astana talks, led, of course, by Russia, Iran and Turkey.
Look, the real issue here is the one that we have only lightly mentioned upon. That's the question of whether there can be peace between Israel and the Palestinians. And the decision to, quote, recognize Jerusalem, something quite strange in international law, is clearly a part of how or in what way the U.S. can be an important influence in that direction. It's a great influence in the president's own popularity and obviously in his role here in domestic politics. It had nothing to do with the fact that for over 50 years, the parties and the mediators have carefully avoided jumping to conclusions on Jerusalem in a way that would block the role of Israel and the Palestinians to reach a solution. With respect to Israel and the United Nations, I spent some time in Israel. There's a small expression in Hebrew called shmum, which generally means let's ignore the UN. On the other hand, it's quite clear that both the United States and Israel are working hard to do what they can with General Assembly membership to keep the vote today from being a kind of 180 to a few disaster for the Israelis in terms of international popularity. It has more small influence in the General Assembly here, a little more in the Security Council, but I think that in the end, none of this seems to be moving forward in the very difficult situation which both Israelis and Palestinians face should they really want a peace settlement, and that's open to some question now. But the Palestinians in particular are divided still between Hamas and al-Fatah. Until they get together, there isn't any kind of unified Palestinian approach to this problem. All of this looks like we're on the dead-end road to further difficulty, if not worse, and that's been a considerable problem. Over the years, we have thought things couldn't get any worse, and they have shown, put it this way, an unfettered capacity to do that. One worries about conflict in the region, and one worries certainly about the unsettled problems. But under the current circumstances, it is extremely difficult, in my view, to be optimistic or hopeful about any of this leading anywhere positive.
Well, Al-Zayat, I'll get you to pick up on that. Sorry for that one. But do you think that there is a chance, as Ambassador Haley has said in recent times, to move the ball forward by Trump's decision to do this, you know, sort of be a disruptor in the region, and by making this move, he's going to get people to come to some kind of negotiating table?
I would like to be an optimist here, but that's going to be really difficult. As the good ambassador said, really, and the previous guest, a lot of this had to do with domestic political consumption for the president and his steadfast evangelical base, including his own vice president. I do think that, you know, if you really want to stretch the possibilities here, this could galvanize the Palestinians and the rest of the international community to work outside the UN and or even beyond just trying to look at the United States for leadership on this issue. But really, this is going to have more to do with economic development, with social justice on the ground, with helping the Palestinians reform their institutions. I mean, just right now, we have an unprecedented attack on Palestinian minors right now who are being detained in Israeli jails. Those are issues that I think the Criminal Court of Justice and other international bodies can take a look at right now in a way to kind of add different kind of pressure on the Israelis and this administration to really do what's right on the ground and potentially open up the avenue for future possibilities. But in terms of leadership from this administration on this issue in a tangible way, I do not see it.
Jeffrey Alderman, can you see a way that the government in Israel could be perhaps brought to a negotiating table by members of the United Nations by this pressure anyway at all?
No, none whatsoever. One of your guests a moment or so ago mentioned the Israeli phrase shmum, and this was invented by the first Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, who said that what's important is not what the outside world thinks, it's what the Jews and the Jewish state does. The United Nations has no role whatsoever to play in any so-called peace negotiations. On the wider issue, I'm afraid I'm a pessimist here. I don't think in the foreseeable future we're talking about anything remotely resembling conflict resolution. The very most we can hope for is conflict management, by which I mean there'll be flare-ups, there'll be riots, there'll be some killings, and then the issue will die down again and then it will flare up again. That's the most we can hope for.
Ambassador Pickering, Jeffrey Alderman says he's a pessimist. While try to be an optimist, where do you sit, and what role would the United Nations have in trying to dampen down what's happening in the region at the moment?
I think very limited, in all honesty. I don't disagree with the two colleagues who've been on this program with me in that regard. I think that one can look back at Resolution 242, which had certainly its reinterpreters before it became part of the international canon on this question. On the other hand, there doesn't seem to be any inclination to go forward in that direction. The Obama administration looked at it at the end of the day. John Kerry made an interesting speech in which he laid out some principles, but that doesn't get to the problem of the leaders, their lack of interest in this particular question on both sides, and in some cases, their lack of capacity in their own domestic environment to try to produce the negotiations, much less the hard decisions that have to be made. I think that it is not sufficient merely to strengthen the Palestinians. They haven't been told that they have an economic test or a social test to pass before they can participate in negotiations, despite the fact that that seems to be, at the moment, the best alternative we have. I'm not against it, but I'm against noting the fact that they have to do this because, in fact, they're not yet qualified to negotiate a political settlement. I do think, however, that probably we're going to have to see some leadership evolution, if I could put it that way, either among the people who are there, that seems close to impossible, or over time replacement before we can get to the heart of this particular question. I agree with Jeffrey that this is going to continue to be a nagging and messy and difficult problem in a region which is also fraught with a lot of other circumstances that are connected with this. But I don't agree, in fact, that over a period of time, there cannot be a solution to this problem. And in many ways, the inability to get a solution of this problem tempers the whole region. And as we look ahead in the longer term, would the U.S. come back in some way to be a more important player? Could it help to mobilize the others, perhaps the quartet, which is moribund now? Could it play a role with the UN? That's possible. But these are all very thin threads to hang on to in a fabric that is fraying very badly.
Okay, Jeffrey Alderman, let me just get you to try and respond, please, to the words of the US Ambassador Nikki Haley and this threat to take names of those who vote against the resolution against the United States today. That's all stick, isn't it? That's not going to help in diplomacy or trying to bring a peaceful solution to the region.
Well, I believe what President Trump and his UN ambassador have said. I think it would not surprise me in the slightest that tomorrow, or even as early as this evening perhaps, the Trump administration would announce that one or two countries carefully picked out of all those well over 100 who will vote in effect against the UN at the Special General Assembly will find American aid cut off. Can I also mention that my contacts in Washington have told me that it is entirely possible that financial sanctions will be applied not merely to countries who vote against the USA today, but also against the UN itself. I think that's highly possible.
And while pick up on that, what do you make of the reports that Jeffrey is mentioning there, that the sanctions will perhaps be wider, not just against those who voted against them, but against the institution of the UN itself?
I mean, certainly such a move, I think, would be almost unprecedented on the part of the United States, that we've done that before against Yemen, as it was mentioned. But that would be incredibly damaging, not only to our reputation, but potentially our bilateral relationship in parts of the world where we have security or political or otherwise interests. And really, I cannot think but that will also hurt our relationships with key allies, including the British and the French, who may look at this move as a very damaging one, and one that sends the wrong signal to the international community on what the United States will not do on this particular issue. This is not a U.S. national security issue. Okay. This is a support for an ally that we've had a relationship with for a very long time. But the United States is not under assault here, and for such a move to happen really would be an overreaction. But I do agree that given everything we know about this administration, it is quite possible.
So some agreement there at the end. Well, Al-Zayat, Jeffrey Alderman in London, and Ambassador Thomas Pickering also in Washington. Thank you so much for joining us, gentlemen. After the break, violence in northern Iraq's Kurdish region. What's next for the local government, and what reaction can we expect from Baghdad? And the United States approves a massive tax overhaul. Are Republicans reforming the system or looting the treasury? Welcome back to the Newsmakers. Cracks are beginning to appear in the Kurdish regional government in northern Iraq. The offices of all the major parties have been attacked in Sulaymaniyah province, and a number of people have been killed in a crackdown by security forces. 2 opposition parties have quit the local government, and as anger grows over austerity measures, unpaid wages, and of course the fallout from September's independence referendum, Iraq's central government says it could step in. So to discuss this, I'm joined here in the studio by Namo Abdullah. He's an Iraqi Kurdish journalist, and in London is the Kurdish writer and journalist Rebwa Fatah. Now, we also invited some representatives from the Kurdish regional government onto the programme, but unfortunately they were not available. First of all, Rebwa Fatah in London. We've seen the violence flaring in Sulaymaniyah province, and then we've had a reaction from the Iraqi central government, a brigadier general saying the Iraqi armed forces could intervene. Do you think that's a good idea?
I don't think so. I don't think intervening in the Iraqi security forces is really a good option. I think Iraq can help in other ways to ease out the situation. Maybe by meeting the Kurdish Authority, maybe by promising to pay the salaries of the civil servants and others. But intervening, adding more fuel to the fire doesn't really help.
I mean, paying the salaries of the civil servants, isn't that the KRG's job?
I mean, that obviously it is disputed. I mean, apparently, I mean, according to agreements and constitution, 17% of the Iraqi, if you like, GDR should go to the KRG, and KRG arguing that they have not received that. Obviously, it's not that simple, because the federal government accusing Kurdish government that they sell oil, and the oil must go to the federal budget and so on. So it's rather, I think they are in a mess because they left it too late, and they didn't manage to solve the problems much earlier. Now we are really in a very bad situation.
I mean, Namo, not solving the problems early enough. You've had 10 years of this, oil revenue coming in. Why were the KRG not able to diversify and fund other projects so they weren't so reliant on oil, and when in the mess they are now?
Well, that's definitely what you're raising a very good point, diversifying the KRG's economy. The protesters, these protests are happening at a time just shortly after the Kurdish people held an independence referendum, which miserably failed. And the Kurdish, it's clear that they were not ready for this referendum. And the Kurdish people, you know, they have almost no source of revenue. So the KRG leadership has almost utterly failed to, to diversify the economy. The agriculture sector has been ignored. Now the oil price has plummeted. The KRG has no money basically to fund it is huge public sector. And by the way, that might be news to some of our viewers that more than 60% of Iraqi Kurdistan's employees are public employees, are government employees, rather than private sector employees.
I mean, they've had all this time and all that money. You say it's maybe a failure of the political leadership, but we have had political parties who didn't want to push for this referendum now. There are a couple of parties who said we should wait a couple of years perhaps for the referendum to be held. Why was it so vehemently pushed forward now to abject failure?
Well, many people were surprised to what happened afterwards. And a lot of Kurds are now mad, not just at their own leadership, but also at the reaction to the referendum, especially from Baghdad. Baghdad has almost collectively punished the Kurdish people after this referendum, which has been cancelled, suspended at least. So the airports in the KRG are closed. My wife, who's here with me, she couldn't travel really unless she had to go to Baghdad, then come to Istanbul. A few months earlier, she could come directly from Suleymaniye to Istanbul, no problem. So the Kurdish people are suffering as a result of this referendum. But you're right, the KRG leadership wasn't ready for this referendum. They told us they were ready. They told the world they were ready. President Barzani himself told the former president, the whole world told the whole world that there would be a more positive reaction to this referendum. But the result was very much different.
Absolutely. Rebra Fatah, these protests that have sparked in Suleymaniye province, there has been reporting that there's some outside influence involved. What credence do you give to those reports? And do you agree with Namo here that this is not just a question of the current leadership, the Barzani and the Talabani family in the KRG, but perhaps the entire political establishment that the Kurdish people are upset with?
I think the entire Kurdish political leadership is corrupt and they fail to provide services. It's not today's problem. It has been accumulating since 1991. I think the Kurdish people in Kurdistan region have been very tolerant, but it come to a point, I think enough is enough. And going back to the question about outside interference, I mean, there's always, when people are unhappy with the services, with the leadership, that's a Middle Eastern thing. It doesn't happen here in London when I'm talking to you. I mean, it's always outside because they don't want to blame themselves. I think that the body that is responsible for today's violence and killing over 90 people and arresting about 188 and I don't know how many people are wounded is really the Kurdistan regional government. It's their failure. It's their failure throughout years. And of course, Masoud Barzani should take the most responsibility because, of course, I understand this is people's unsatisfaction with jobs, with corruption, with the rest of the issues in the KRG. But what didn't really help Masoud Barzani's adventure, naive adventure with the referendum. And of course, people in Kurdistan today believe that, if you like, they are humiliated, not by Kurdish political forces, but by Iraq, by Turkey, by Iran, because they all together oppressed Kurds after the referendum. I agree with my friend Namo in the studio. Abadi tried to play a tough man, punishing Kurds, like closing down the exits to the international community. That has nothing to do with the Barzani of Kurdish leadership. That's people like me and Namo suffering. We cannot go back to see our families. So I think, although it's total failure of the Kurdish administration, but the Iraqi Federal Authority must also take lion's share for that, because throughout there, they couldn't diplomatically or politically solve their problem with the KRG. It came to a point that they have to use Shia militia groups to attack Kurds, and there's many people as a result of that attack killed, and that's not really helpful. So people's anger is not just against the Kurds, the Kurdish administration. It's against Abadi, against and the regional powers that they all go together, punish Kurds for Barzani's adventure. I think the person should have been punished, should have been Barzani and his leadership, not the people.
Okay, Rebwa, let's go to Baghdad and bring in a guest that we have in the Iraqi capital, Ahmed Rushdie. He's a foreign policy advisor for the Speaker of the Iraqi Parliament. Ahmed Rushdie, you will have heard some of what Rebwa Fatah was saying there. Just how much blame do you think the Iraqi central government have to bear for what is currently happening in the KRG?
Well, first of all, let's talk about what is the definition of the crisis that between Baghdad and Erbil. It's a humanitarian, political, and economical. At the same time, there is already a humanitarian, political, and economical crisis inside KRG. So both sides, Baghdad and Erbil, needs to understand the situation well. At the same time, we must not forget that we have elections in 2018 that's supposed to be KRG or Kurdistan or the Kurdish people should participate in it, which means that all the crises that I mentioned before should be solved before the elections, or there will be a problem inside the national elections of Iraq, which is also give some sort of evidence that it cannot the national elections cannot be happen in April, because all these crises, all these level of crises, actually pushing Iraq toward not to be on a settlement near the elections. Now, according to what's happening between Baghdad and Erbil, it's supposed to be there is a door opened by the international community, is that the international community, like IMF, International Bank, and the UN, should help Iraq in the financial crisis. At the same time, should push the Iraqi government to settle its problem with Kurdistan by paying the 12% budget. But also, the Iraqi government said, what are the guarantees it will reach to the people? Because we all know that the corruption inside KRG is very high. So all these negotiations now are on the table, but it should be settled before the elections, or we're going to see something else.
Ahmed Rushdie, I mean, that's all very well and good, expecting the World Bank to help out the international community, but the seizing of Kirkuk after the referendum, that was in no way helping the KRG. It was actually taking money away from that organisation. How do you answer that?
Well, for the referendum, if I understand the question well, Kurdistan said we are respecting the judgment, or let's say the decision of the Supreme Court, of the Federal Court in Baghdad. And the Iraqi government saying that it's supposed to be you are obeying the decision because you are inside Iraq. It's not you are respecting the decision.
So although they're autonomous, they have to obey every decision made by central
on the table. It should be that the referendum should be settled in a way that the results should be freezed or should be denied or rejected in a way that at the end the settlement will happen between Baghdad and Erbil. Now, Mr. Abadi is looking for, as a political man, to put the crisis as it is, not changing anything, because it will help him inside the election itself in next April.
I mean, you're shaking your head there, Rebwa. Do you want to respond to what you heard coming from Baghdad?
I mean, first of all, I mean, I don't know how many. Obviously, my friend in Baghdad answered the question. Let me go on by. The Kurdish authorities is corrupt from top to bottom, but there are more corruption in the federal government. There's no doubt about that. I mean, there are figures, there are Transparency International puts like Iraq in, I don't know, right to the bottom. Okay, that's. And secondly, there was no reason whatsoever to attack Kurdistan by Shia militia groups, an unconstitutional group, and claiming that implementing constitution, okay? Let us put that, let's just kill that, okay? And obviously, the crisis today, the civil unrest in Kurdistan and bloods on Kurdish streets, Mr. Abadi should take some responsibility, because Kurds feel humiliated by the Iraqi federal state because they were killed, they were attacked, their land being confiscated. And what they tell me, my friend Baghdad, saying Abadi is trying to solve the problem. Abadi made the problem more complicated and strained the relation between Baghdad and Erbil. It's beyond me that the federal government could not sit with the regional government in order to solve the problem peacefully. They had to use illegal Shia militia groups supported by Iran to attack part of Iraq. Let us not forget, Kurdistan is not a foreign country. Kurdistan is Iraq, okay? I think my friend Baghdad must realize that very, very well. Kurdistan is Iraq.
Rabwa.
And if Mr. Abadi, as the prime minister, cannot solve the problems in his own land, so he's a failure. He's totally failed.
Unfortunately, we don't have any more time on this, but Namo, Abdullah, Ahmed, Rushdie in Baghdad and Rabwa Fatah in London, we thank you very much for joining us here on The Newsmakers.
My pleasure.
Well, President Trump has got one, a win. He's managed to pass the most significant tax cut in decades. It passed both Republican-controlled houses of Congress in the face of fierce Democratic opposition. Not one Democrat voted for it. The bill will see temporary tax cuts for most people and permanent reductions for corporations and the rich. But it's not all about taxes. Amendments will allow oil drilling in the protected Alaskan wilderness, and the bill kills a requirement for Americans to buy healthcare. So who really wins? We'll debate that shortly, but first, here's Basil Rehan.
We are giving them a big, beautiful Christmas present in the form of a tremendous tax cut. It will be the biggest cut in the history of our country. It'll also be tax reform, and it'll create jobs.
President Donald Trump has made good on his Christmas promise to overhaul the country's tax system. It's also the Republican Party's first big legislative victory under Trump. Needless to say, they're savoring every moment.
Something this big, something this generational, something this profound could not have been done without exquisite presidential leadership. Mr. President, thank you for getting us over the finish line.
While Republicans rejoice, many others are expressing despair. Critics say the new U.S. tax code looks more like the Grinch who stole Christmas.
It's an all-out looting of America, the wholesale robbery of the middle class.
We are witnessing highway robbery in broad daylight and a looting of the federal treasury.
The Senate vote on a new tax code was split along party lines. U.S. Democrats were unanimous in their rejection of the bill. They say it gives too much to the rich and too little to everyone else. The new tax code amounts to a $1.5 trillion tax cut. Individuals and families will see a modest bump in savings for a few years. Wealthy Americans will get a rate reduction of nearly 3%. Most of the savings, however, will go to big corporations. Their rate is being slashed from 35% to 21%.
We advance the promise of opportunity every time we speak out on behalf of lower tax rates, freer markets, sound currencies.
The U.S. hasn't seen tax reforms like this since 1986. That was at the height of what many Republicans affectionately refer to as Reaganomics. Much like Trump's tax code reform, President Ronald Reagan gave massive tax cuts to corporations and the wealthy. Those policies arguably ushered in a new era of U.S. economic expansion.
Madonna, I'm a bodyguard.
But they also nearly tripled the U.S. national debt and left a contentious legacy on U.S. fiscal policy lasting until today. Many critics of the new Trump tax plan say it's on a similar debt trajectory. They say the bill was poorly designed with little thought and a lot of rush. How rushed? Ask Democratic Senator John Tester.
It's the night we're going to be voting on the tax bill. I just got the tax bill 25 minutes ago. This is the tax bill. See how thick it is?
Tester showed off many last-minute amendments to the bill, written by hand in the margins.
Can you tell me what that word is?
The speed at which this bill was pushed through Congress worries many critics, especially because it includes several non-tax related provisions with broad social implications. They range from allowing oil and gas drilling in Alaska's Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to eliminating a key requirement of the Affordable Care Act. Americans will no longer be forced to buy health insurance, effectively gutting Obamacare. Altogether, this new bill will bring major changes across the U.S. The question is whether those changes will be positive, or whether, as critics say, they'll amount to getting a lump of coal right on time for Christmas. Basil Rehan, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined from Washington by Andy Green. He's the Managing Director of Economic Policy at the Center for American Progress. Also in Washington, we have Romina Boccia. She's the leading economist at the Heritage Foundation. And in Paris, we have TRT World's Editor-at-Large, Craig Capitas, who's regularly featured on all of our programming, including Money Talk. Welcome to you all. First, Romina Boccia, now that Trump and the Republicans have managed to push this bill through, not without some help from you guys at the Heritage Fund, is there anything that you've seen in it now that you don't like?
Yes, I think that there were some missed opportunities in terms of closing more loopholes and deductions, but the bill certainly moves in the right direction. I'm very enthusiastic about the reduction in the corporate rate and full expensing, which will drive up economic growth and provide higher wages for workers, both of which were goals that the president set out when he was first campaigning. But there are quite a few expiration dates in the bill, so it will give lawmakers another opportunity to clean up the tax code even more, further simplify, and get rid of some of those special interest loopholes and deductions that they weren't able to get rid of in this round.
Andy Green in Washington sounds all good to me. Lower corporation tax, higher wages. What's there to complain about?
Well, if you're an American who has not seen their wages rise in a very long time in a meaningful way, who's seen their wealth collapse following the financial crisis of 2008 and the Great Recession, who continues to face unemployment challenges or other challenges with just making ends meet. This bill does little to nothing for them, little to nothing for you, but provides millions and billions of dollars to the very wealthiest and very largest corporations. So if you think those are the right priorities for America, then you should love this bill.
Romina, you're shaking your head. Let me come back to you and come in on that before we go to Craig in Paris.
You know, we've been hearing these false talking points for months now, and the American people will soon realize that they are just false talking points, because this bill provides tax cuts for virtually all middle-class and lower-income Americans, and many corporations have already announced, including AT&T and Comcast just this morning, that once the tax bill goes through, the first thing they will do is provide $1,000 bonuses to their workers. So workers will see the benefits from this tax bill right away. They will see a reduction in their payroll taxes as soon as February or March of next year. And they will also see higher wages over the next decade as additional investment in the United States for making America more competitive again with this tax bill will create more demand for U.S. workers, and that will drive up their wages in the long run.
So Craig in Paris, Romina, the Republican, likes it. Of course, Andy Green, the Democrat, doesn't. You're an American in Paris with a bit of cash in your pocket. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that this tax bill proves that Donald Trump believes he can make America great again by monetizing everything. He's run this campaign like he would one of his game shows on TV. Come on down, we're going to give you money. And now the Republicans are going to run out and try and sell this bill between now and the midterm elections. And they might well be able to do it. You have to remember something. American politicians have one goal in life, and that is to be reelected, unless they either retire for reasons of health or are pushed out now on sexual misconduct allegations. So this gives them something to run on. And it does not inconvenience Americans. They're going to have some money in their pocket. It might not be long-term, but Americans think in quarters, whereas Chinese and other countries think in tranches of 50 to 100 years. Trickle-down works very well for the short term.
Andy, trickle-down works for the short term. Are you in agreement with that? And what changes would you have made to this bill? Because you can accept that the American tax code was arcane and needed some kind of reform.
Well, you know, let's set the record straight on a couple of things. First of all, there's not much reform in this. There's just a lot of cuts for the folks at the very top and tiny, tiny crumbs for ordinary Americans. You know, my colleague from the Heritage Foundation pointed out that everybody gets a little tax cut. That's true in 2018, but let me tell you how much you get. If you make $20,000 to $30,000 a year, you get on average $180. If you make $50,000 to $75,000, you get about $870. Those are good things. But what if you make $500,000 to $1 million? $500,000 to $1 million, you get $20,000. $1 million plus, $60,000. If you are in the top 0.1%, you're going to get $193,000 just in 2018 from this tax cut. And what's more, it doesn't create jobs at all. Those numbers about wages being increased really have a lot more to do with monopoly and the application of one particular company seeking to buy another company and further create monopoly in our economy. And so handing out wages to make nice with Donald Trump and his antitrust regulators is frankly quite concerning. The good news is that democracy exists in America. This bill is extraordinarily unpopular. Politicians are salivating around the country to run against this bill. And we've already seen a credible victory in Alabama by a Democrat, Doug Jones, where Democrats have not won at all. And the Democrats are, running against this bill nationally, are holding a strong lead against the average Republican. So, this bill, folks will have to run on it. And I guess one more point I'd make is that the history of these tax cuts don't create jobs at all. They hand money back to shareholders via buybacks. There's already been $80 billion in buybacks associated with just the passage of this bill. That money's not going to go to shareholders. It's not going to go to raise wages. It's going to further concentrate economic power among those who already have it, ice out small business, and leave workers scratching for crumbs.
Romina, you were shaking your head there, but I'll not have you delve into the weeds of some of those details coming from Andy. But one thing I do want you to pick up on, during 8 years of the Obama administration, all we heard from Senate Republicans was debt and the deficit and how we can't spend any more money. Now, all estimates say that this is going to explode the debt, $1.5 trillion. What's happened to those deficit hawks?
I think explode the debt is an exaggeration, because our national debt, it is at $20 trillion, but it's not driven by too little tax revenue. It's clearly driven by too much spending. And just to put this in perspective, that $1.5 trillion is less than a 2 to 3% reduction in overall projected revenues over the next decade. And what we also find is that once you account for the economic growth effects, that $1.5 trillion shrinks significantly. By better, more accurate estimates show that it'll be closer to $700 billion to perhaps $1 trillion. But even that doesn't account for the fact that as you lower tax rates, you do provide greater incentives for investment, for additional work that will drive up revenues. There's certainly some improvements that could be made to make this bill even more pro-growth, and I hope that lawmakers will take another crack at those provisions. That means closing more loopholes and deductions, making sure that businesses can write off the full cost of their investment, not just over the next 5 years, but permanently. Those are the kinds of pro-growth changes that will ultimately help American workers. And we don't need to look very far. We just need to look at Germany and Canada and pretty much all of our trading partners that have reduced their corporate rates. The worldwide average is only about 23%. The U.S. rate will be set at 21%, but we also have state and local rates. So the total will be more like 25%, 26%, but we're much more close to the worldwide average, and that means America will be more competitive again, and that means more foreign direct investment and more business activity in the United States, and that will drive up wages for workers. It's happened in Germany, it's happened in Canada. In fact, workers bear the brunt of the cost from corporate taxes. They collect it at the corporate level, but it's ultimately workers who bear the pain.
Okay, Craig, we've had Two economists arguing, throwing out lots of numbers. What's Joe Sixpack in Pennsylvania going to think about all those numbers? Is he going to really care about debt or deficit if he sees a bit of extra cash in his pocket at the end of the month?
Yeah, it might only be $180, but you know what? It's better than a poke in the eye, and he didn't have it before. And if there's promises of more money coming, he's going to like this tax bill even better. Look, this is a cavalcade of numbing numbers that few people outside the policy wonk community actually pay any attention to. This bill will be sold to the American public or not sold to the American public by the politicians. Now, we've heard a lot of numbers, and believe me, this bill is full of all kinds of numbers. However, the most significant number in this bill, as I see it, has to do with how much money certain groups are getting back. According to this tax plan, there are going to be $70 billion in cuts benefiting foreigners, foreign corporations who own stock in U.S. companies. That's a substantial amount of money. The number of cuts that are going to be benefiting middle-income people, 23 billion. That is really skewed, and I think that the long-term sustainability of this bill would be better if those two numbers could have been turned around, and that 70 billion in cuts was going to middle-class Americans who need the money more than a bunch of foreign corporations.
Absolutely. Okay, Craig, we've run out of time, but just a final thought for all of you to leave you with. It'd be interesting to know what the president's going to gain from this, but of course he still hasn't released his tax returns. Romina Boccia from the Heritage Foundation, Craig Capitas in Paris, and Andy Green from the Centre for American Progress. Thanks for joining us. Well, that's all for this edition of The Newsmakers. Do check out all our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. I'm Kamali Melbourne. Thanks for watching and goodbye.